Good morning. Good morning, everyone. How are you? I hope you're well. Thanks so much for joining us this morning here in Durham anyway, for the second in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences faculty at Duke University. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. While I regret that we cannot meet over breakfast this morning in Smith Warehouse at Duke University, our usual TGI FHI location, I'm really delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs, information about upcoming ones, and also an interview with our speaker today, Professor Lee Baker, in which he describes his work. This morning, I'm really pleased to introduce Professor Lee Baker, who is Mrs. A. Haymeyer Professor of Cultural Anthropology, Sociology, and African American Studies at Duke University. Lee is the author of 2 monographs, From Savage to Negro, Anthropology and the Construction of Race, 1896 to 1954, from from University of California Press from 1998, and from 2010, Anthropology and the Racial Politics of Culture from Duke University Press. In addition, he's the editor of an additional book, Life in America, Identity in Everyday Experience from Blackwell, 2003. At Duke, he has served as the chair of cultural anthropology and has also served as Duke's Dean of Academic Affairs for 8 years, from 2008 to 2016. He's been the recipient of various prestigious fellowships, including at Harvard's W.E.B. DuBois Institute, the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Johns Hopkins Institute for Global Studies, the University of Ghana, from the University of Ghana, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Humanities Center. And he's also won numerous teaching awards. Lee's work is broadly in the area of the history of anthropology, particularly in the US, while his articles range over topics as broad as sociolinguistics to race and democracy. His books have addressed the manner in which American anthropology addresses the US. He argues that anthropology played a key role in forming American popular attitudes towards race and culture, refining the meaning of these terms through contrast in their application to Native Americans and African Americans. Franz Boas emerges as the pivotal figure in his work in the development of ideas of race and culture. In his second monograph, Lee works through vignettes to describe how the treatment of the so-called Indian question and the Negro question related to each other, the racial politics of culture and the cultural politics of race, systematically inverted the relationships of culture and biology, he explains, in an ongoing political context of discrimination that is rationalized by scientific racism. Late 19th century social thought muddled concepts of race, culture, blood, civilization, and nation within a persistent evolutionary hierarchy, whether based in biology or culture. Boas, he argues, clarified and thus created the terminology and critique of racialist arguments as bad science and bad public policy. In a recent article, The 1-2 Punch in the History of Anthropology Review, he provides a vibrant account of the culture around race that DuBois and Boas together resisted and sought to change. Today, he will be expanding, I think, on that work. His talk is titled W.E.B. DuBois, Franz Boas, and the Real Race Problem. Thanks so much for joining us. Over to you, Lee.
All righty. Thank you so much, Ranji, for that gracious introduction, as well as inviting me to share some of my brand new research. I wanted to just give a couple shout outs and thank you to Angela Wee, who was my research assistant this summer, did a great job. Tracy Thompson, Daphne Lamont, who helped me work through some of these issues, particularly with folklore in Africa. Sarah Rogers, of course, who did all the logistic stuff, as well as the History of Anthropology Review, like reading group, who read a version of this before and gave me some great feedback. So I'm just going to jump in here and I'm going to share slides afterwards because I just can't figure out how to do that at the same time. And I think this just reads pretty well. So this is called W.E.B. Du Bois, Franz Boas, and the Real Race Problem. In 1939, W.E.B. Du Bois sardonically quipped that the Negro was the football of anthropology. However, St. Clair Drake noted, Du Bois, like other Black intellectuals, judged anthropology partly in terms of how favorable or inimical it was in the vindication struggle. American anthropology of the mid to late 19th century was inimical to the struggle because people like Josiah Nott, George Glinton, Samuel Morton used anthropology to prove that the Negro was naturally and inherently inferior. Thus, Negroes were not among all men who were created equal and therefore could be property to enslave, trade, and bequeath. Anthropology in the United States changed significantly when Franz Boas began challenging ideas of racial inferiority in the hierarchy of cultures. A German immigrant of Jewish heritage, Franz Boas is often considered the father of American anthropology, and he was influential in challenging and debunking scientific racism. In the late 19th century, anthropology moved out of museums and government bureaus of investigations and into colleges and universities. A generation of anthropologists influenced by Boas began to head up new departments and old journals throughout North America at the dawn of the 20th century, forever hobbling scientific racism. Always the pragmatist, Du Bois saw Boas and anthropology as an ally, and he consistently used, or perhaps leveraged, anthropology, and by extension Franz Boas, in two specific ways. The first was using anthropology to showcase advanced African civilizations of the past, which proved that people of African descent could participate in a civilized society and could create it. Second, he used anthropology to demonstrate that there was no proof that one race was inferior to any other. In this lecture on Du Bois and anthropology, I will outline the relationship between Du Bois and Boas during the first decade of the 20th century and describe how Du Bois pragmatically used Anthropology in the Crisis and other publications to elevate and vindicate African Americans in the struggle for freedom, liberty, and justice for all. I will also highlight the racist anti-racism of American anthropology because Boas sincerely believed the real race problem was the slow pace of racial amalgamation. This section I call Du Bois Invites Boas to Atlanta. At the turn of the century, Jim Crow immobilized, lynchings extinguished, and sharecropping eroded Black people and their humanity in the South. Although it began as just a trickle, the Great Migration began as the suffocating caste system in Dixie started to push the pioneer migrants north. Tempest-tossed migrants joined the huddled masses of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe in dilapidated tenements in the low-wage workforce. And, and like the Slavs before them and the Italians before them, settlement houses, charities, and reformers were there to help integrate and assimilate these newcomers to the cities. Prominent among these organizations in New York was the Charity Organization Society, which employed the new scientific philanthropy, which was motivated by the desire to uplift the poor from poverty through discipline, religious education, and employment so they could support themselves without government assistance or individual handouts. The primary goal was to use science to determine who were the deserving poor and who were not. Immigrants who were insane, feeble-minded, blind, crippled, criminal types, alcoholics, tubercular, or prostitutes did not need uplifting. They needed to be off the streets, in asylums, sanatoria, or prisons. Research, surveys, investigations, and statistics were critical to the success of the so-called scientific charity and philanthropy. The Society published its studies in Charities, a review of local and general philanthropy. In 1905, Paul U. Kellogg was the managing editor. He organized a special number that was, quote, devoted from cover to cover to the social interests of the Negroes in northern cities. The 96-page volume was a veritable who's who of the experts of the Negro problem. Booker T. Washington advanced that businesses should come and stay in the South. Francis Keller wrote about the exploitation of women coming north, and Mary White Ovington wrote about housing challenges. Others reported on the causes of Negro migration, crime, disease, settlement houses, labor unions, and efforts to stem the migration north. Kellogg commissioned W.E.B. DuBois to write an article titled "The Black Vote of Philadelphia." He elegantly and succinctly answered the question, quote, and this is actually in one sentence, why are Philadelphia politics dirty? Because the most influential and respected citizens of the town are using public business for private gain. Joining the familiar cast of Christian reformers, social workers, and social scientists was a newcomer, Franz Boas. He wrote an essay called "The Negro and the Demands of Modern Life, Ethnic and Anatomical Considerations." In language typical of the early 20th century, Boas explained that, quote, the Negroid races are characterized by a higher degree of pigmentation, wavy to frizzly hair, thick lips, and size of brain less than that of the other division of mankind, end of quote. But he also explained that, quote, our knowledge of physiological data that have bearing upon the question of racial capacity is entirely inadequate. Boas suggested, quote, almost all we can say with certainty is that differences between the average types of the white and the Negro that have bearing upon vitality and mental ability are much less than the individual variations in each race, end of quote. Boas then explained that one should look to African civilizations and African art to showcase their love of labor, thrift, and power of organization illustrated in the governments of native states, and when wielded by men of great personality, has led to the foundation of extended empires. Boas posed a poignant question about the undesirable traits of Negroes. He questioned that if they were innate traits or, quote, due to social surroundings which we are responsible. He concluded, the tearing away from African soil and the conquest of complete loss of old standards of life, which were replaced by dependency of slavery and by all it entailed, followed by a period of disorganization and by severe economic struggle, heavy odds, are sufficient enough to explain the inferiority of the status of the race without falling back on the theory of hereditary inferiority. In short, there is every reason to believe that the Negro will be when given facility and opportunity, will be perfectly able to fulfill the duties of citizenship as well as his white neighbor. Paul Kellogg explained to DuBois that the special number of Charities will be published on October 7th, and a complimentary bundle of 12 copies will be mailed to you on that date. When DuBois received his bundle, he immediately wrote to Franz Boas asking him, quote, for the best and latest works bearing on the anthropology of the Negro, because the subsequent year's Atlanta conference was going to focus on the Negro physique. He then asked, would it be possible for you to consider coming here in May and addressing the conference? To make the invitation even more enticing, he offered up his, quote, 2,000 Negro pupils and students who could be carefully measured. Boas wrote back within a week that there was no work that was, quote, particularly good on the physical anthropology of the Negro. Boas eventually accepted DuBois's invitation to the conference at the end of May. Edward T. Ware, the acting president of Atlanta University, asked the eminent anthropologist to give the commencement address after the conference, and he hoped that that the occasion will prove one of real interest for him. In Atlanta, Boas contributed to the Conference on Negro Health and Physique by providing extemporaneous remarks that mirrored those published months before in Charities. For the commencement address, Boas tried to strike an optimistic and inspirational tone for the young graduates, most of whom were to become school teachers whose pupils were growing up in a world defined by a whirlpool of mob violence, degrading humiliation, and confined opportunities. The influential Columbia University professor implored, quote, "The fundamental requirement for useful activity on your part is clear insight into the capabilities of your own race." He did not draw on examples from the heroism of Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching crusade, the magisterial oration of Frederick Douglass's abolition campaign, nor the poignant poetry of Phyllis Wheatley. He chose to inspire with examples of African empires. Quote, "While much of history of early invention is shrouded in darkness," he thundered, "it seems likely that at a time when the European was still satisfied with rude stone tools, the African had invented or adopted the art of smelting iron." He explained to his august audience that, quote, "This was an achievement of the highest order, as great as the discovery of steam power or electricity, if not greater. The evidence of African ethnology is such that it should inspire you with the hope of leading your race from achievement to achievement." He extolled the virtues of Zulu military organizations, praised the intricate forms of government that united kingdoms of heterogeneous tribes, and admired the vast commodity markets and sophisticated judicial system. Quote, "Nothing perhaps is more encouraging," he bellowed in the staccato of his German accent, "than a glimpse of the artistic industry of native Africa." Stonehall Chapel was sweltering, but the audience of dignitaries and students were captivated as he drew to the climax of his address. Boas preached, "This picture of native Africa will inspire. If therefore it is claimed that your race is doomed to economic inferiority, you may confidently look to the home of your ancestors and say that you have set out to recover for the colored people the strength that was their own before they set foot on the shores of this continent. You may say that you go to work with bright hopes that you will not be discouraged by the slowness of your progress." He extended this theme of slowness in the conclusion of his address, deploying examples of Indian castes, Armenians in Turkey, and the Manchurian conquest in China. He instructed the students to, quote, "Take up your work among your race with undaunted courage. Success will crown your endeavors if your work is carried out patiently, calmly, and consistently." He reiterated that in every single case in history, the process of adaptation has been one of exceeding slowness. Do not look for the impossible, but not let your path deviate from the quiet and steadfast insistence upon full opportunities for your powers. Although Boas inspired the graduates with the accomplishments and inventions of ancient African empires, his advice was to be respectable, work twice as hard, expect half as much, and wait until white people figured out that you are not inferior. Quote, "If therefore you want to overcome the old antagonism, you have to be on your watch all the time. Your moral standards must be of the highest." He explained that the stakes were high because, quote, "Any failure of one of your race will be interpreted only too readily as a relapse into the old ways of an inferior race." Boas never mentions the impossibility of mobility in the Southern caste system fueled by white supremacy, nor does he say anything about debt peonage, convict leasing, Jim Crow segregation, disfranchisement, or the industrial terrorism which structured the social, cultural, and economic oppression of African Americans while elevating even dirt poor whites to a station of esteemed privilege. Boas's message of patient gradualism came on the heels of Du Bois and Monroe Trotter's Declaration of Principles of the Niagara Movement, where they called for demanding, protesting, and agitating for our civil rights. Nevertheless, the address had a profound impact on Du Bois. In Black Folk Then and Now, this is 1939, Du Bois reflected upon portions of that address. Franz Boas came to Atlanta University, where I was teaching history in 1906, and said to the graduate class, "You need not be ashamed of your African past." And then he recounted the history of Black kingdoms south of the Sahara for 1,000 years. I was too astonished to speak. All of this I had never heard, and I came then and afterwards to realize how the silence and neglect of science can let truth utterly disappear or even be unconsciously distorted. Although Du Bois acknowledged the influence of Boas, Du Bois pursued this line of research much more broadly and robustly than Boas ever did. But that initial push came from Boas. In 1963, Harold Isaacs interviewed Du Bois. He asked Du Bois to reflect upon how his interest in Africa blossomed. Quote, "But Africa still never came to the center of my thought," Du Bois revealed. "It was something in the background. There was always a lack of interest, a neglect, a resentment at being classed as Africans when Negroes felt that we were Americans. I did not myself begin actively to study Africa until 1908 or 1909. Franz Boas influenced me to begin studying this subject, and I really began to get into it," end of quote. Historian Tracy Thompson notes that while Du Bois reflected upon the influence of Boas, he does not mention others. She calls this the puzzle of Du Bois's silence. She is skeptical because Du Bois implies that he was not aware of the work done by Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, David Walker, and William Wells Brown, all of whom extolled the virtues of African civilizations well before Boas. This next section I call the real race problem. The NAACP officially incorporated during its second annual conference in New York City during mid-May 1910. The theme of the conference was disenfranchisement and how it works. During the morning and afternoon sessions, members convened within the stately United Charities building on Park Avenue near Gramercy Park. The first day they distributed credentials and conducted a business meeting. For the evening plenary, there was a distinguished panel at the Cooper Union. And now I'm going to describe what some of these descriptions are from newspaper descriptions. So when I say quote, it's quoting the newspaper. Quote, 700 or 800 Negroes packed in the auditorium where Ray Stander Baker, the influential journalist and author of Following the Color Line, led off the panel. The inestimable Ida B. Wells followed and provided, quote, a vivid description of the lynching of Will James in Cairo, Illinois last November. The renowned labor lawyer Clarence Darrow came to the dais next. He gave a sarcastic, irreverent, yet biting address. Quote, what the Negro needs is not more work, but more wages, he barked. It may be a long way in the future, he forewarned, but intermarriage between the races finally will settle all difficulties, as it has in the case of the Irish and German and other people. Darrow took swipes at industrial education, the clergy, and the franchise itself. The world so far, he lampooned, has failed to prove that it can vote itself into any condition that is worthwhile. Loud whoops, uproarious laughter, and thunderous applause emanated, quote, from the young Negroes in the audience, and increasing silence and embarrassment among the philanthropists on the platform. End of quote. However entertaining, Darrow did not strike the keynote envisioned by the staid and serious-minded reformers, so the master of ceremonies, and this was in the paper, tiptoed across the big platform and instructed him to return to his seat. The next 2 days included a packed schedule of intense business meetings and star-studded panels. Professor Kelly Miller from Howard and John Dewey from Columbia, author Charles Chestnut, the powerful banker come philanthropist Jacob Schiff, and of course, Professor DuBois, each contributed to the proceedings. The dramatic 3-day extravaganza coincided with a close encounter with Halley's Comet, which illuminated the night sky each evening. The celestial augury proved propitious because the incorporation of the N.A.A.C.P that weekend created a galactic shift in the movement for civil and human rights. The grand finale for the conference took place in Midtown, 20 blocks north of the Charity buildings at the storied Berkeley Theater. The closers, Albert Bushnell Hart, Mary Church Terrell, and Franz Boas, were 3 of DuBois's most esteemed and influential collaborators, and there is little doubt they were each handpicked by him. It is also an explicit example of how DuBois leveraged his relationship with Boas and pragmatically conscript anthropology into the service of into service for the struggle of vindication, uplift, and civil rights. Hart was the president of the American Historical Association, a distinguished professor at Harvard University. He was a prolific writer and influential editor who covered a vast array of subjects in American history. He was also DuBois's dissertation advisor. Mary Church Terrell was past president and one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Club and sat on the executive committee of the newly minted N.A.A.C.P. Among the first Black women to earn a master's degree, she was a leader in the women's club, suffrage, and civil rights movements. Terrell brought the thunder that evening. She was direct and forthright. Again, these are newspaper descriptions. The cold acquiescence of the North in the disfranchisement of men in the South, she forewarned, is treason to the Constitution. And she underscored the high stakes. Quote, she predicted disastrous consequences to the nation from this disfranchisement because she said it would either make the Negroes a cowardly, supine, useless race or a race of desperados and anarchists seeking violent vengeance for their wrongs. Hart was more sedate, contending that, quote, interests in the nation are better served when the Negroes of ability are so educated that they have an opportunity to be of service to their race. He challenged a handful of strands among the massive array of debilitating myths that form the warp and weft of the fabric of white supremacy. He denounced, for example, quote, that education unfits the Negro for the work he put in this world, that education breeds crime, and that the Negro race has deteriorated since slavery. He was articulating many of the themes of the book he had just completed entitled The Southern South, 1910. To the esteemed audience at the Berkeley Theater, however, he did not mention the inference he drew in his book that, quote, the Negro is inferior and his past history in Africa and in America leads to the belief that he will remain inferior in race stamina and race achievement, end of quote. Boas' paper was the finale, and it was titled The Real Race Problem, and he began his lecture using his signature formula and preferred tactic to combat the science of racial superiority, which was serving as a scientific skeptic and debunker in chief. Quote, the first question to be answered by scientific investigation is, he began, in how far the Negro type may be considered the inferior while the white type the superior. He asserted that, quote, anthropologists recognize that the Negro and the white represent the two most divergent types of mankind. But let's explain that, quote, the whole anatomical and physiological comparison of the Negro and white race may be summed up by the fact that hardly any traits develop in a manner that we are justified in calling one race anatomically or physiologically higher than the other, end of quote. So far, Boas had given what had evolved as something of a formulaic stump speech that was a mashup of that article in Charities and the commencement address at Atlanta University half a decade earlier. Unlike previous lectures, Boas shifted gears from describing and debunking to prescribing and provoking. Boas shared an observation that in countries around the world inhabited by Northern Europeans, particularly Teutonic nations, the intensity of race feeling is calibrated by the magnitude of the social divisions. Boas was not optimistic that our general attitude will change to any appreciable degree within a measurable time. So he prescribed for the Negro the somewhat successful strategy of German Jews, not necessarily Russian Jews, of actively assimilating within American society. In 1921, Boas described the strategy more succinctly, quote, "The Negro problem will not disappear in America until the Negro blood has been so much diluted that it will no longer be recognized, just as anti-Semitism will not disappear until the last vestige of the Jew as the Jew has disappeared. In a race of octaroons living among whites, the color question would probably disappear," end of quote. At the Berkeley Theater, he advanced a provocative strategy. It was nothing short of conceding that if you can't beat them, join them. Boas stated, quote, "It seems obvious that our race problems will become less the less difference in type there is between the two groups of our people," concluding that, quote, "one aspect of the solution of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself." Perhaps he should have said herself. Boas sincerely, if naively, believed that African American women should take proactive steps to quicken the inevitable process of lightening up the race through amalgamation. The previous year, he presented a rather clinical description of amalgamation to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For the N.A.A.C.P, however, he gave a full-throated exegesis on the gender dynamics of interracial sex and the racial politics of classifying children born from those sexual unions, voluntary or not. Quote, "The simple facts that Negroes and Europeans live side by side in our country, that the European receives constant large additions from abroad, while the amount of Negro blood receives no additions from outside, must necessarily lead to the result that the relative number of pure Negroes will become less and less in our country. The gradual process of elimination of the full-blooded Negro may be retarded by anti-miscegenation legislation, but it cannot possibly be avoided." Boas was aware of what he called the bulky literature of the subject of miscegenation, most of which he believed did not stand up to serious criticism. He also understood the phantasmic panic, fear, and ensuing violent terror meted out on the bodies of Black men who allegedly polluted the purity of white womanhood. However, Boas implied there was no need to fear because there was, quote, "a serious misunderstanding of the actual conditions of intermixture between the Negro and white." This is a long quote, but I think it's important. The fear is often expressed that by intermixture between whites and Negroes, the whole mass of the white population might be infused with a certain amount of Negro blood. This is not what has actually occurred, but would result if unions between white women and Negro men were as frequent as unions between Negro men and white women. As a matter of fact, however, the former type of union, that of the Negro male and the white female, are exceedingly few in number as compared to the others. It therefore follows that our mulattoes are almost throughout the offspring of Negro mothers and white fathers. It thus appears that in all cases where mixture between whites and Negroes occurs, as long as this mixture is predominantly a mixture of white fathers and colored mothers, the relative proportion of blood in the following mixed generation becomes less, and that therefore gradually increasingly similar, and that therefore a gradually increasing similarity of the two racial types may develop. Boas stated that, quote, "this one aspect of the solution of the Negro problem lies entirely in the hands of the Negro himself." Wittingly or not, Boas was prescribing a program of applied eugenics as a solution to the race problem, and white people need not fear amalgamation because it only improves the Negro race and does not impair the white race. Boas never mentions the 300 years of industrial terrorism in the form of routinized rape of Black women by white men. Yet not so subtly, he implies that the solution to the real race problem lies between the legs of Black women. The New York Times headline, Professor Boas predicts race amalgamation means Negro elimination. Union of white fathers and Black mothers will bring this about. The Baltimore Afro-American reported extensively on the three-day conference and excerpted many of the conference speakers. The editors declined to mention Boas except as one of many speakers. Du Bois selected Boas as the real race problem as the lead article for the second issue of the first volume of The Crisis. In 1912, Du Bois subsequently reissued it as one of the N.A.A.C.P's many standalone pamphlets. In the months between Boas's address at the Berkeley and its publication in The Crisis, Du Bois wrote Marrying of Black Folk, which he addressed the issues raised by Boas. Writing in the first person, Du Bois averred, I believe that mingling of blood between white and black and yellow races is neither unnatural nor physically deleterious. The choice of one's spouse should be an individual decision. One should, however, choose a spouse wisely, he cautioned. Quote, I believe that there are human stocks with whom it is physically unwise to intermarry, but to think that those stocks are all colored or that there is no such white stocks is unscientific and false. In those cases where there is physical, cultural, and emotional compatibility across the color line, he clarified, such unions are not necessarily undesirable, and race blending may lead and often has led to new, gifted, and desirable stocks and individuals. As if responding directly to Boas's naive prescription for widespread amalgamation, Du Bois warned, I believe that, quote, I believe that wholesale intermarriage of races during the present generations would be a social calamity by reason of the wide cultural, ethical, and traditional differences. According to Du Bois, differences in culture and traditions were far more salient a barrier to amalgamation than differences in limb length and hair texture. Du Bois dismissed Boas's rather fanciful solution and vehemently opposed hereditarian doctrines of white supremacy that use science as the rebar of racism. It is not entirely clear to me why Du Bois promoted this address so conspicuously. Did the ever pragmatic Du Bois make a calculated decision that the body of the address, which the nation's foremost anthropologist explicitly argued that the Negroes were not inferior to whites mentally and physiologically, outweighed the cringeworthy solution? Or did Du Bois want to promote any legitimate science that endeavored to hush the relentless din of panicked scholars reinforcing Jim Crow by claiming that African Americans were inherently inferior and warning that miscegenation would befall American civilization? Although cringeworthy today, the vast majority of Americans would have found his solution not only repugnant, but profane. Du Bois may have simply wanted to promote a pugnacious yet distinguished scientist using scientific evidence to articulate the principle of equality. Boas, on the other hand, was engaging in racist anti-racism. The real race problem was written as he was wrapping up changes in bodily forms of descendants. His massive research project that showed how European immigrants demonstrated, quote, this is Boas, the marvelous power of amalgamation our nation has exhibited for so long a time. In this study, he demonstrated how the cephalic index of the short-headed Hebrew and the long-headed Sicilian converged into an American type in one generation. He believed that to show how little white racial groups diverge, he must emphasize the vast gulf between whites and other races. He often slipped and slid between American type, American, and the white race. In 1910, he contributed to the aligning of whiteness with what it means to be an American in critical ways. One could, and I'm not saying I am, one could surmise that for Boas in 1910, the real race problem was that the Negroes were not white. This is the conclusion. Du Bois and Boas cultivated a lifelong friendship. For example, in 1911, Du Bois and Boas were two of a handful of Americans American contributors to the first Universal Race Congress in London. Du Bois continued to use anthropology and anthropologically inflected methods in texts when he felt they could serve his priorities. Unlike his peers, Du Bois did not embrace folklore to describe and explain the vernacular culture of Black folk. As Daphne Lamothe argues, he used humanities and engaged people's feelings and experiences as living culture. Supporting, publishing, and promoting Allison Davis, Irene Diggs, St. Clair Drake, and Arthur Fawcett was Du Bois's most influential contribution to the field of anthropology. Du Bois's influence over the N.A.A.C.P. led to its tenacious legal fights for civil rights in the courts. Boas's sway over a generation of anthropologists led to an evidence-based science of race and culture. Their respective spheres of influence came full circle when Thurgood Marshall deployed Boasian anthropology as a critical stanchion in the N.A.A.C.P.'s argument that school segregation was unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. Thank you so much. I think what I'm going to do real quick now is share my screen and go through just a couple of these slides. Let me move. So this is the charities, the Negro cities. This is a copy of the Negro Demands. This is Stonehall Chapel, where he gave his address at Atlanta University. This is the Charities building in New York, where they had the N.A.A.C.P. Had its first or second, annual conference, but it was incorporated in the second year. This is the Berkeley Theater on 44th Street. This is Albert Bushnell, Mary Church Terrell, Franz Boas, the closers, if you will. And this is the New York Times. Franz Boas predicts racial amalgamation may be retarded by legislation, but cannot be means Negro. And so this was very popular in terms of it was widely covered in the media.